So, I've been thinking, as I've been working on these sessions, putting together my thoughts, basically trying to figure out what it is about world building that makes it so enticing, so interesting and exciting. And I've talked about this a little bit before, but a couple of other notions came up to me. And chief among them was writing, art, and world building, and basically how they all come together. Because they seem to bounce off of one another. And I became curious, are they necessary components? Do you have to write in some capacity to truly be world building? Can you world build without art? Or is art a fundamental component and perhaps writing is not? These kinds of thoughts are, I think, sometimes on the surface superfluous. Things that are not particularly important or necessary to discuss or to think about. But I think sometimes when we delve into those kinds of things, we start to learn a little bit more about whatever it is we're thinking about. Sometimes we gain better knowledge, sometimes we gain further insight, and I think that pursuit alone is kind of worth it. But let's start with that basic idea then. Is writing necessary for world building? And by the way, this is world building session 33. I've got a whole bunch of these if you want to check them out. And if you've been enjoying this manner of content, I would highly encourage you to consider liking and subscribing. I don't mention it much, or at least I haven't in the past, but it certainly does help out. My name is Zach, by the way. So, do you have to write? Is that a necessary component of world building? I'm going to go off on a limb and say yes, that it is a necessary component. I'm not 100% sure that that's actually what I believe, but I find that generally starting from a point like that and working backwards is often best for my mental processes. So let's kind of chew on this for a minute. I think that writing, if you are building a world, is always going to be a beneficial thing. And if we take that a step further and assume that it is a necessary component, where does that get us? I don't think writing always has to take the form of a book or a novel or even like a blog or a Wikipedia type of thing. I think sometimes the writing component can just be the notes that you put on the sides. It can just be little reference points for yourself. So when you come back to things later, you have a better understanding of what it was you were trying to communicate. Maybe you didn't quite accomplish or didn't have the skill to accomplish what you wanted to in that particular drawing. And as I think of this, my mind immediately goes back to all these people who work on video games or movies. The guys who designed all of the weapons and backgrounds and armor and creatures for Lord of the Rings or for World of Warcraft. And all of those people, whether they were involved in the actual design of things or just drawing and sketching cool beasties, they pretty much all write a little bit. I would say for most of them, the writing is pretty simple. It's confined almost entirely to notes that they make on the sides of things. But I don't think that's any less important. I think that simple notation is perhaps the first step. You draw a thing, and then you go, well, I don't really have the skill at this moment to put down every single aspect that I want to include, so I'm going to have to write some notes on the side, either for somebody else when they take a peek at this later, or even for myself when I come back to this, because I can't guarantee I'm going to remember everything I remember at this exact moment. So you start putting notes on things. And all of a sudden, those become a little bit more detailed. And especially if you start working with other people, you've got to explain things a little bit more thoroughly. And all of those pieces start to develop a pretty rudimentary system of writing for your work. And again, it is probably very rudimentary at first. But I don't think that necessarily makes it less important or impactful. The writing component seems to be a pretty necessary component. And if you are writing for a novel, if you are world building for a novel, obviously there's going to be some writing elements there. If you're building stuff for D&D or Pathfinder, there's obviously going to be those things. If you're doing it for a video game, So what is the scenario where you could be world building and there's no writing at all? Well, I would argue that if that's the case, that the writing is simply happening in your head and you haven't happened to put it down yet. And what I mean by that is simple. If you are actually world building, you're trying to be consistent. You're trying to construct things that are tied into one another, that build off of one another, so that you can have this elaborate construction with many interesting features and facets. And in order to do that, you have to have consistencies. And those consistencies are going to be things that, if you're not writing them down, they're just existing in your mind. But I would argue that you're just avoiding the writing them. The writing basically exists, and you are just not putting it down. And that doesn't mean that like it's a call to arms, like you need to fix that about yourself and be more honest and true. Perhaps it could. But that's not what I'm saying or implying here. I'm just thinking that if you are not writing, but you are world building, that there are writing elements and they're just not quite yet making it into your work. So maybe if you are a person who is world building a lot and you haven't begun writing anything, and maybe something about your world feels a little bit off, a little bit less consistent than you would like, maybe try starting to write things down. And don't worry about trying to like tell a story, because I think that can be really intimidating for a lot of folks. It certainly was intimidating for me. But I did find that when I created essentially my own Wikipedia thing, I used a program called Mac Journal, and I started detailing out all manner of, the names of swords and countries and kings and emperors and queens. When I started doing that, it meant that I had a higher level of consistency. I had something I could come back to when I was crafting something else and needed to remember or be reminded of who was reigning during this period, what the name of that thing was. In some cases, this can be the creation of languages and stuff like that. But the documentation component, I think at the very least, is really important for world building, for consistency. And also just because it takes the burden of remembering off of you. It's hard to remember everything you've created. I can't imagine having to do that. That would just, feels like that would be fundamentally like uninteresting and just difficult. I don't want to have to do that. But I do think that some writing is necessary, even if it happens inside your mind. But I was also thinking about world building in general, and if it is, like, by its nature, fundamentally different from other forms of art. And this is an interesting thing to process, because I think there are a lot of people who world build who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves artists. And this is an interesting thing to me. Can you world build without actually picking up a pencil and making artistic marks on a page? Well, I think you can. I think this takes the form of building languages and writing stuff out. I mean, I know that Tolkien did a little bit of drawing, but it certainly wasn't his strong suit, and it's certainly not what he dedicated most of his time toward. His son did a lot of the actual drawings. I know Tolkien did some of the original maps and things like that. But you can definitely world build without art. However, I think that world building without an artistic component, even if you're not an artistic person, even if world building or like the drawing aspect is really difficult for you, I would say that learning some rudimentary art skills is probably an amazing tool. Let's say that you are building out D&D campaigns or just, whatever, system you're using, and you don't do any art. I think that your campaigns would benefit from you taking a little bit of time and trying to learn how to draw, how to represent some of the things that you're working on. Yeah, you can go find reference material. Maybe you could even, work on photoshopping things together, but visual aids are super, super important. We as humans are so primed to use our eyes to see and to understand new things. And if you are able to bring those things to light, it's going to be tremendously beneficial. And the thing is, like, you don't have to be very good at art in order to get really interesting things down. Like the stuff I'm doing right here, if you watched any of the 2 prior sessions, these were just shapes that I started with and then I took and I kind of crafted into buildings and whatnot, you could follow along with those last 2 sessions and you could devise a whole bunch of buildings yourself. Obviously, if this is the first time you're doing it, they're probably going to look pretty shoddy, but that's okay. You know, that's how things start. Art is a skill, and it's going to take time for you to get better and better and better at it. But the thing is, like, if you follow along with that video and you keep practicing, you will get better. And inside of, 3 to 6 months, you will have buildings and cities and swords and weapons and all kinds of stuff that are really cool and really interesting. And that will give your world, whether it's for players or for yourself or for your spouse or whatever it might be, that will give them a lot more to go off of and understand what's happening inside your head. And it is much cooler if you're able to share things that are inside your own brain with other people. It adds another layer of humanity to things, and it makes it exciting and enriching. So I do think that if you are world building without any artistic components, that you should probably start trying to incorporate some art into things. I know obviously this is an art channel, so the overwhelming likelihood is that every single person listening right now is an artist of some kind. But I know better than to assume that that is actually reality. And so if you are a world builder in some capacity, I would encourage you to start taking on some artistic things, even if that's not really in your wheelhouse, and maybe even especially if it's a little scary to you. Art is often scary at first just because it's an unknown, and I get that. It sucks to be bad at something. And whenever you start a new skill, you're bad at it. That's just part of being human. But I would encourage you to try to invest some time into this. And I guess this kind of goes back to the original thing I was chewing on there a moment ago, which is world building fundamentally different than other forms of art? I am, again, going to just start with, yes, it is, and then we'll see where we go from there. I think that, in general, the purpose of world building is a little bit different. It has some similarities in that your overarching goal is to communicate something. But you're not trying to communicate something about what's happened in your life here or make a person feel something necessarily. Your goal is to communicate something about a fabricated world, which means you almost have to be a little bit exaggerative. Like, you need to be a little bit over the top because you're trying to communicate something about something that isn't real. And so sometimes that means using more vibrant colors. Sometimes that means going over the top. It's the same reason that our fiction is often a little exaggerative from what real life is. We find that when we're exploring things in fiction, we are looking at an analog of our reality. And when you do that, sometimes having something that's a little bit more extreme is a better way to wrap your head around it. What does this look like? Because I'm talking too much in the abstract, I think. Well, I think about the racism that is explored in Lord of the Rings between the elves and the dwarves. And it's almost comical in the way that it's kind of put together at points, because it's such an ancient prejudice and it's something that these groups are holding on to, and there's so many background elements. But having it that way, where those races are truly different, the different statures, different lifespans, they were literally created by different beings in that universe. God created everybody except for the dwarves, essentially. One of the Valar got really excited and wanted to teach people smithing, and so he created the dwarves himself and tried to bring them to life but couldn't. And so literally could not be more fundamentally different. Well, what does that do for us? It's a good analog for us to understand such concepts in our own world and to wrap our head around them in a way that is, not necessarily fraught with all the same emotions and reality that we encounter in our own world. And fiction allows us to do things like that. You can explore difficult concepts in fiction that would, if that exact thing was written in a realistic scenario, it might be too crass. It might be too difficult for people to wrap their heads around. It might be offensive. It might be traumatizing. And so each of those aspects kind of encourage us to try different things in fiction. And so world building carries those same aspects. It often is an exaggerated form of reality in order to explore things for, productive cases like I was just mentioning. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just fun. Dragons don't exist in our world. It's fun to be in a world where that exists. We are kind of top dogs on this planet. So it's kind of fun to play with eldritch horror and Lovecraftian stuff where we are forced to deal with the fact that humans are very, very small and that we are, maybe top dog here on our planet, but probably not in the, overarching universe. I think those kinds of things are things we get to explore in fiction that are really good for us to get a handle on. They make us more human, make us more filled out. We get to be better versions of ourselves by exploring and contemplating these other pieces of what it is to be human, what it is to be alive in some cases. So there is this exaggerative element. I mean, it's still about communicating, though. Like, world building in general is still about just communicating, but it does seem to be fundamentally different in some aspects as well. I don't know. Art is such an interesting thing in and of itself. Like, there's so many aspects to it, but I think at a fundamental level, it has to be about communicating. And sometimes it's communicating to others. I think predominantly that's the case. But sometimes it's communicating things to yourself or working through things. And I would still say that's a form of communication, though it is quite a bit different than some of the other aspects for sure. So I don't know. I think world building is different than a lot of other forms of art, but is it like astronomically different? Maybe not. Maybe not. It's still about communicating. It's just communicating slightly different things. But another thing that I find really intriguing, this is something that kind of came up as I was processing this particular session and thinking about what I wanted to talk about and whatnot, was there's a lot of examples of what I'm going to refer to as cloaked world building. And that's world building that is like hidden in plain sight, or it's something that you're engaging with, but you don't necessarily know it right off the cusp. So what do I mean by this? Well, I feel like anytime you're telling a story, there's generally world building elements in there as well. So I've got friends that are writers and some that are working on, children's books, some that are working on, historical fiction, some that are working on things all over the place. Very many different topics that these people are, writing in. And I don't think most of them would call themselves world builders. I think, honestly, it's the fantasy nerds and the sci-fi nerds that tend to call ourselves world builders. And there's a reason for that, of course. But I think if you really think about it, regardless of what you're writing, if you're telling a story of any kind, there are world building elements to it. Now, it's very likely that those world building elements, if you're writing, historical fiction, are just elements of our actual world. But it's very infrequent that a story is just reality. You're always going to focus on particular elements more than others, and because we're getting internal components of characters, well, unless you're writing like an autobiography or a biography, there's always going to be elements that you are choosing to emphasize, elements that you're choosing to change or shift or exaggerate. And I would argue that anytime you do that, anytime you touch on something that has to do with the world around your characters, anything that is not directly character related, you are working on world building elements. I'm thinking about some books here like The Sun Also Rises or The Old Man and the Sea. These are obviously pieces of fiction, but they're set in historical settings that they could have hypothetically happened, right? Yet, there are world building elements to those things. The giant fish that gets pulled in, the bullfight, and all of the, crappy post-World War I stuff in The Sun Also Rises. Like, those things are world building elements. Yes, they are consistent with our own world, but they are things that are being heightened or exaggerated or played with. So I would argue that regardless of what kind of story you might be working on telling, there are world building elements there. And once you understand that, you can focus on things. You can figure out which ones are most important, which ones are going to determine or change or shift certain things about what story you're telling. And some of us, are not storytellers. I obviously think that it's a really important thing. It's a fundamental component of what it is to be human. I grew up with a father who not only read me books, but who actually would make up stories. And it's part of the reason I think that I have this strong desire to tell stories, because that's what I grew up with. And so I've started doing that with my daughter. I obviously write books. All of these things are, coming into play in that aspect. What else, though? Well, if you are an artist who is just designing a whole bunch of versions of the same thing and you're iterating on it, let's say you're drawing swords. Let's say maybe that's a little bit too on the nose, right? Let's say you're just designing like some buildings, or you're designing a character and you're focusing on the clothes that they wear, and you keep drawing it. Like you're dissatisfied with this piece of cloth, and so you draw another one and you draw another one, and you continue to just build more and more of these things, trying to get them consistent, trying to maybe make them make sense inside whatever scenario you've set up. Maybe they're things for school, maybe you want to go into fashion design. Anytime that you're iterating on the same thing, and it's not for like practical causes, like you're not going to build this thing, there's a good chance that there's some world building element there. I found this a lot with students both when I was in school and when I was teaching, who would basically just continue drawing the same thing a ton of times. And eventually what happens is they would often get themselves into a scenario where they had made changes to whatever this thing was, and they had edited it. They had made it their own in some aspect, and had started to play with it and alter components. Sometimes this was as simple as they liked a video game, and so they were, drawing themselves in that video game. Or maybe they loved Pokemon and they were making their own Pokemon, just iterating off of things and doing different versions of stuff. There's a good chance anytime you're doing that you're actually contributing in some small or mean way to world building. If you are designing something that allows you to have an OC, an original character, or any kind of scenario in that realm, there's a good chance that you are working on someone else's world building. And maybe that's an aspect that needs to be talked about here too, is that world building doesn't always have to be your own world. There are people who professionally, their job as a concept artist is to design worlds for video games. Like those aren't games that they came up with necessarily. They're just things that they are invested in, maybe just for the job, maybe because it's fun and enjoyable, but there's a lot of other things that way. So this one's perhaps a little bit less solid than some of the others, but I think that sometimes, especially for artists, when we find ourselves iterating on the same thing over and over and over again, there is a good chance that you're just kind of accidentally establishing some kind of world, that you're building elements that are all of a sudden, they're now consistent. All of a sudden, all these characters have the same kind of clothes. All the clothes are built from the same things. So, could show up in that way. And I think that often just very simply shifts into thinking about why something is built the way it is. If you're sitting there and spending a lot of time thinking about, well, the reason that this garment would be designed this way, the reason this building would look this way, the reason this plane would be built out of these materials or would have this particular wing structure, especially in that last scenario, you might not think of that as world building. But if you're designing an aircraft and you're not just thinking about function and like, this is the best way to design this thing, there's a good chance that you're actually working on like some fundamental world building. Because if you look at it and you just go, this is the best way to build this thing, that's great. That's an engineer. And we need engineers. But if you are working on, like, this is the past way that this car was designed. Like the new Corvettes are built in a particular way because of what the past Corvettes were. And you can make a good case that when you are designing something like that, when you are moving things forward and thinking about hearkening back to an older version of a thing, paying homage as it is, or as it were, you are actually looking into like the subtle world building of a thing. And it's weird to think of that in our own world. Like, does world building actually show up in our own world? That's a very complicated question. I do not know. If you think you have an answer to that, I would love to hear it because that would be really intriguing. Is there any non-fictional world building? You know, obviously, like I mentioned, like you could world build, you know, for a story that you're telling that did actually happen, but like, is it still world building if it has to do with reality, with the world that we live in? I do not know. I do not know. Probably not is my like gut feeling, but I'm really curious. So let me know in the comments below what you think about that. Can you have like real world building, or is that just history? But I do think that like when you project things forward, when you're trying to think about and imagine what the world might look like in 50 to 100 years, you're thinking about what the planes would look like, what the buildings would look like, the cars. I think that you are subtly world building. You are taking a look at the history. You're trying to assume and make assumptions about how things would go, how things would change. And I think all of those are world building elements. So it shows up there, I think, too. And it's also going to show up anytime you're working on any kind of art where you're really considering background elements and how all of the background elements come together and what they're there for. Because that's essentially like the second you're in any kind of story, whether it's a comic, a book, a video game, whatever it is, the second you get outside of character stuff, like you're dealing with world elements. Any of the movies or cartoons or anything like that, any of the stories that we really like, they have world building elements. They must. I think it is just like a fundamental thing that has to be there. And sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's inconsistent, but it seems like it's always there in some capacity. So why do we do this? Why do we as humans find it so compelling to build worlds? Because we've done this almost as long as, it was possible. When you look back at old mythologies, in a lot of ways, what they were was us attempting to explain things or using the natural world to teach lessons to young people. There are a lot of reasons for this. Whether you are a religious person or otherwise, there's a good case to be made that a lot of religions are essentially world building. You are essentially trying to understand and construct a reason for why things are the way they are. And unless you have the very, very unique perspective that like all religions have truth to them, or are true, then essentially some would have to be not true, which would then make them world building. But there's something, I hope I didn't step on anybody's toes there. I'm just exploring these things philosophically. I'm not throwing any shade at anybody. But I do think it's interesting to think about it from a religious angle. If you are a religious person, if you feel like and believe that humanity was created by a deity of some kind, and that we were plopped here with purpose on this planet, I think it's really easy to make a case for why you want to world build. Because a world was built for you, and then you were put inside it. Like, that seems absolutely fundamentally understandable. Like, if you are a religious person that feels like I keep saying feels like, I don't mean that, I mean believes. If you are a religious person who believes that this world was built, if not explicitly for humanity, then humanity in part, then of course it makes sense to world build. It's actually like one of the most honoring things you could do to your creator, because you are echoing what they have done for you. And that's a really intriguing and cool thing. So if you are a religious person, I totally understand why world building could be such an exciting and interesting and important thing for you. But what about the other side of that? What if you're an irreligious person? You maybe are atheistic or agnostic. Maybe it's just not of great concern to you. You haven't put a lot of time into that. Real life occupies a lot of time, and maybe you haven't gotten there. And that's fine too. If you believe that we are just here as a product of wonderful, epic chance, then we are still in a world that has developed over eons to exist and sustain life, and what a wonderful, exciting thing. And especially if you are the kind of person who enjoys science fiction, that can be so much fun because we essentially then exist on a world that has just arrived by chance, and we get to be here and we get to live, and oh my goodness, how wonderful and exciting that is. So when I look at it that way, it seems like almost the most logical thing you could do artistically, whether you are a religious person or otherwise. Like, why wouldn't you want to put time into world building? Like, we live in a world that was either built for us or developed over eons, and both of those are really fun to do. Like, it's really fun to sit down and think about, like, this is a deity who's creating a planet for my elves, or my orcs, or my aliens, and what would that look like? How would that be put together? What kind of stories would they tell? And it's also fun to go, this is a planet that developed out in the cold ether of space. How did things develop? How would life come to exist? What would intelligent life look like there? Would there be any? Those are both wonderful and exciting things to process. And so regardless of your perspective, it seems to me that world building is just almost fundamentally human. And it's exciting and it's interesting and it's so cool. I love it. I love it so much. And obviously, I don't want to pretend that I can reduce all of humanity down to like those two individual concepts, right? Of being religious or irreligious. Humanity is incredibly complicated, but if I try to, take the time here to talk about every component and every angle that humanity could be coming from here, oh my goodness, we're going to be here forever. So I am not intending to cover all of people in the ways that I talk about these things, and so please just understand that, be gracious and kind with one another. I know we've got a lot of people in this audience that are religious, and I know that we must have a bunch of people who are not at all either. As long as we're all existing and being kind to one another, it doesn't really matter in this space. So, but world building, ironically, like the more I think about it, and especially when I have those really rare days where I'm like, why am I doing this? Like, what am I doing? Why am I wasting my time? I have to think about it and remember that this is actually like one of the most fundamentally human things you could do. Tell stories to explain why we are the way we are, how we exist here, what's going on in our world, or just to play our own like juvenile version of creator, to build things and develop things. And I think it's a really good way for us to interact with our world. This world that has either been created for us or that we just have the pleasure of existing in. What a wonderful, exciting gift. Either way. Well, as always, thanks for being here. I hope this one being a little bit different and just discussing some random pieces of why this is important and why I think this is such a fun and engaging thing to do. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. I'd love to hear below what kind of stuff you're working on in your world building right now. I know I ask that frequently, but I assume it changes because, we keep working. Things keep changing and shifting. So I always like hearing about what all of you guys are doing. Thank you to my patrons who are on the screen right now. If you want to check out the Patreon, you can feel free to do so at the link. But more importantly, right next to that is the link to the Discord server. And I would encourage you to check that out, especially if you do not currently have an artistic community. It is a small community of people who can chat and talk about their artwork, get feedback on things, share what they're doing. Sometimes we'll do challenges on there. We usually have weekly drawings. Lots of cool stuff there. All right. I'm going to keep going for a moment here, but have a good one, y'all. See you soon.